Earlier this year, Mr. Clark gave an additional 201 boxes, and we didn't dare transfer that to meters, but it's 201 boxes, and they cover his activities up to 2014. So I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the archivists who currently work on the Clark Fond, Geneviève Couture, if you want to stand up, and Rachel Classy. And I want to give a shout out to other archivists who are in this room who also worked on the Clark Fond in the past. So again, thank you for accepting this invitation. I mentioned youngest prime minister, only Alberta-born prime minister, distinguished foreign minister. Which achievement are you most proud of?
Well, you know, you have to acknowledge my parents' role in where and when I was born. So I can't, I can't really claim that. And on that question, I suppose a lot of people mislead others when they talk about being 39, but I actually was 39 when I was. It wasn't a sleight of hand. I was proud of them all, obviously. It was an enormous privilege, among other things, to be the Minister of Foreign Affairs in a time when the country was so active. And I had acquired as Prime Minister, and it was reaffirmed as Foreign Minister, an immense respect for the Canadian Public Service. And particularly in those times when, I think as in all times, surprises happen, and our ability to respond to them effectively depended very much on that. I'll surprise you about perhaps what was the part of my career that I think was most important and maybe most singular, because it wasn't in either of those portfolios, it was in Constitutional Affairs. When, even though the people of Canada rejected the agreement in a referendum later on, we were able to get agreement, a unanimous agreement, not only among all the governments, but among the four major Indigenous groups on major changes, really major changes in the Canadian Constitution. And what was interesting about that was that it proved that when you get Canadians together in a room, speaking frankly and openly with one another, you can find agreement. Sometimes, there's no question that governance is very complicated in the world. And I think we underestimate how difficult it can be in Canada. But it seems to me that one of the things that happened during that Charlottetown negotiation was that we proved that the country can work, that if we invest both openness and energy into what we're trying to do, we can get agreement. And I was very pleased to be a central part of that. There are others in the room here today who were active in that as well. And as I say, I'm very conscious in heaping that praise on the Accord that my view was not shared by most of the Canadian people. That has to do with electoral politics more than domestic negotiation. But it does prove that open-hearted, genuine domestic negotiation can work.
And there's consensus now that there's no appetite in the country for reopening those discussions. You share that view?
I think the times have to be right. The times then were right. I'm not sure entirely why. On one of the questions that was key then, the question of relations between other Canadians and Indigenous people, I think there has been a reassertion of an interest in resolving some of those problems. We would never have made the progress we did in Charlottetown had there not been that general sense, both within the Aboriginal community and outside, to move forward. It waned then. It was low for a while. And I think there is a genuine determination on the part of all sides. Whether or not that will be reflected in the kind of flexibility on both sides, the Indigenous side as well as the non-Indigenous side, in subsequent negotiation is a question to be determined. And partly as a legacy of the time when interest was low, I'm concerned that there are too many hard lines being established on both sides. But I believe that with the combination of both present atmosphere and the precedent of the agreements in Charlottetown and elsewhere, the Kelowna Accords, we can solve these problems. And it's good to remember that there were times when we did. Yeah.
Great. Let's go back to the fact of being only 39
Yes.
when you became prime minister. Our current prime minister was criticized as being too young for the job. So is there such a thing as being too young to be prime minister?
Well, I spent a good part of my career being critical of the present prime minister's father, but not about the time of Justin's birth. I think, in fact, there are surprises for everyone who becomes prime minister. There are things we are simply not prepared for. It may be particularly the case when you come, as he did and I did, from parties that had been in opposition for some time, because you have not had the opportunity to serve an apprenticeship in a cabinet. And certainly, looking back, there are some things that if I had them to do over again, I would do differently. Yeah. But I think that is a factor. One of the things that's interesting, I don't want to stray into this territory, interesting about the U.S. system is that there is a deliberate period between the election and the taking of office. And in most cases, that is used to acquaint the new coming head of government with some of the complexities and dynamics that they're going to face in office. We rush into it. I mean, I was off to my first G7 conference 2 weeks, 3 weeks after I had won an election. And I was well served by my public service, but there were a lot of things that they had not thought about warning me about that, as I say, I would have benefited from. Well, I have learned in hindsight that there were options that weren't available to me at the time.
But that's regardless of age. Even if you had been five years older, it would have been the same circumstance.
I think so. There may be a tendency on the part of younger people to be a little more certain we know what we're doing than not. But I think it all balances out. One of the advantages of being younger, I think, is that you may be more in touch with some of the currents in the population that tend to be currents of change, and the currents in governments do not tend to be as much currents of change. So I think there may be that advantage, but it balances out. I don't think there's a... Young people have sometimes asked me, how can I become prime minister? How can I become a foreign minister? And you shouldn't plan on it, but you should prepare for it. And that means you have to, there are certain qualities that I think are important. I think an understanding of the perspective of people other than your own is critical. A respect for others is critical. And by and large, we've had that in Canadian prime ministers.
You used the phrase middle power to describe Canada. And I know you strongly believe that a middle power can make a significant difference in international affairs.
More so now than ever, because we're in a very odd time in the world. For some time, it's been clear that the great powers are not as there are other powers than great powers. To a degree, there haven't been for some time. The age of superpowers is not over, but it's certainly waning, and tensions are growing. We're in an unusually tense time now. Naturally, like others, I've been thinking about what's been happening in the United Kingdom with Brexit, what's happening on the continent of Europe, what's happening in the Philippines with elections that are largely run against a status quo, electing a new president who's really an unknown quantity, and of course in the US. But as one looks back on it, for the period since the Cold War, since the end of the fall of the Berlin Wall, we've lived in a time when different forces were coming together. For example, the forces after the Cold War, in the early days of globalization, the forces of the private sector, without maybe meaning to, combined with people who wanted to deal with international poverty, And in fact, one of the consequences has been that the numbers of people who are really poor have declined as a result. But there's also been an atmosphere, as I say, of cooperation, of coming together, of connection. And I think we're now in an age of disconnection. It's not simply that we've stopped connecting. It is now that forces who in the recent past have cooperated are now looking for ways to disagree. As I say, that clearly, in my view, happened in the Brexit vote in the UK. I've seen some of the very good polling analysis of the US election. And there are two factors that were really interesting about it. One was the degree of public anger. And among the most angry were some of the supporters of candidate Clinton. Many of those perhaps had come from the Sanders campaign, but nonetheless. And certainly, President-elect Trump won an enormous number of votes of the angry. But the other thing that was interesting is the growing distrust of big institutions. The polling I saw looked back to some of the questions that have been asked after President Reagan was elected. When President Reagan was elected, most of the people who voted, whether for Carter or for Reagan, were optimistic about the country, did not, when they were asked the question, do you think that you were run by big interests? Several said yes, but far lower percentage now than now. And one of the things that the polling indicates is that there is a widespread distrust of institutions that we all assumed would work and that we could count on. That's a major challenge for us all, because those of us who live in institutions are shaped by them. And we are less like, and we understand that their eccentricities sometimes exist for a purpose. We know the world isn't simple, and for a long time, because there was a trust in institutions, populations would say, well, if they think that's all right, I guess it is. I've got to get on with looking after my family and building my life. And I think now that trust in institutions is leading again to a sense of social disconnection. Other things are happening. We're facing issues we've never faced before. We're facing, in Europe in particular, we're facing the sweep of refugee movement that had not been anticipated. And the pressures are very different from what we feel here. In the US, a lot of the people who voted for Trump came from places where they had assumed, they'd grown up assuming that they and their children would have a solid future, and now the industries on which they've counted are gone. These are major changes. And so in this kind of world, that happens domestically, it happens internationally. And the need for entities, countries that can connect with others is highly important. We have better credentials to connect with others than almost any country in the world. We're a member of the Group of Seven, the economic powers. We're unquestionably an economic power, but we have these connections with others. I'm surprised when I go to other countries sometimes, and I've sort of read the briefs about what I should be expecting, to find that in many cases, the chord that is struck, I was in Indonesia recently, the chord that was struck was one of both having been colonies. And the Indonesians recall very clearly that at the time when they moved towards independent status, among the countries that was first in supporting them was Canada. And why was that? Well, in part because we had been a colony too. And I think that those credentials are credentials that have, for some time, been at the heart of how Canada could contribute. It's a middle power capacity for a country like ours that also has wealth. And I think that we have to, as we look at our foreign policy, we have to look at where that can happen, not just on our continent. We have challenges on our continent now, of course, but I think well beyond our continent. And so I think that capacity is of critical importance. Among other things, it means we should really be considering how much of our international focus we put upon our military capacity and how much that should be balanced by our diplomatic, our bringing together capacity. We have enormous strengths and tradition in both, but there is a tendency now, as more people get more afraid of more things, that our recourse will be to get at the others rather than to get the others together.
How do you see the future of multilateral institutions? Because they, again, bilateral seems to be the way to do things today. So how do you see the future of UNESCO, the UN?
I'm among those who believe that the UN is essential. It's classic. It obviously has its weaknesses and its inefficiencies. It deals with the world's toughest problems, so it's not surprising it has those. And many of its inefficiencies are shocking, in fact. But it's the classic situation that if there weren't something like the UN, we would have to create it, simply because it is a forum where if consensus is going to be found, it can be found there, and the spirit of people working together is. There's going to be, I think bilateralism and regionalism are growing more than we expect. In Africa, even though the African Union, which is the continent-wide organization, is much stronger than it used to be, many of the countries are more comfortable in some of their regional organizations in the response both to crisis, and to disorder, and to disease. In West Africa, for example, where there have been recent instances of both, it was ECOWAS, the West African organization to which governments turned. So regionalism is happening in the world, and we can't discount that. But we have to recognize that just as countries have to come together, so do regions. And that is what happens in multilateralism. We played a major role in creating the multilateral, Canada, age that is that now needs renewal, not just in on the political, social side with the UN and other organizations, but militarily. Canada was one of the founders of NATO, and indeed it was a Canadian trade officer who led the discussions that led to the first World Trade Organization, the establishment of the GATT all those years ago. Again, it's a field where Canada has a record, has a capacity, has a standing that we should be using. And we can't, if we believe in multilateralism, we can't stand back and wait for others to refurbish it. We have to do that ourselves.
And that's a great opportunity for Canada.
It's a great opportunity for Canada, I think. Yeah.
One example of that is the leadership we did demonstrate in the fight against apartheid. And shown here is a photograph of you and Nelson Mandela. That was taken only 2 weeks in 1990. That was in Lusaka, Zambia. Only 2 weeks after Mandela was released from prison in Cape Town. So was that a turning point, our initiative, the role we played in the Commonwealth with the United States? Was that a turning point for Canadian diplomacy?
One has to recognize that the people who made the greatest difference in South Africa were South Africans themselves. But one also has to recognize that they couldn't have done it alone. And they needed friends who were going to be actively with them, and indeed, in my view, who were going to be with them through the long haul. One of the forces we faced during that period was the understandable desire by a number of really eminent Canadians to simply pull out. They wanted to shut our embassy. They wanted to send a signal to South Africa that the world wouldn't put up with that kind of regime. And I resisted that, and the Mulroney government resisted that, because we felt we could be more effective being on the ground, actively helping. I think that was important. Internally, in South Africa, there's no question that Canada helped. And the government was important, of course, but citizens helped. Civil society in Canada was very active. The trade union movement in Canada had an enormously positive impact there, because it made connections with the South African trade union, COSATU. There were issues that came to my attention as minister, where my excellent officials didn't have a direct answer because they didn't have lines into people on the ground in South Africa. Well, COSATU did, and the Canadian Labour Congress through COSATU did. And that was important. It was also important in the Commonwealth because one of the problems with multilateral organizations, precisely, is that their leadership has to be current. And from time to time, it has to change. And both the great sort of fraternal organizations, La Francophonie and the Commonwealth, were started as mother country organizations. And for a long time, there was a deference to the former mother country. There still is in La Francophonie. And there was, and there still is to some degree in the Commonwealth. It's part of history. But the leadership in the Commonwealth had been, as a practical matter, British for a long time. And on the question of apartheid, the British and the Canadian governments took different views. It isn't that Mrs. Thatcher supported apartheid. She didn't. She personally thought it was wrong. She thought our approach to it was also wrong. And that meant that when there had to be an organization that could mobilize the rest of the Commonwealth, the British were not able to play that and to accept that role. And the Commonwealth turned to Canada, and I chaired on Canada's behalf the meeting of the series of meetings of the Commonwealth Committee on Foreign Ministers on Southern Africa that coordinated not only the approaches of the huge, the international organization on which the sun never sets, but also we were able to use our combined force to ratchet up sanctions to make sure that they were not simply a lonely action by one country. They were coordinated and they were persistent and growing. And I think it has made the Commonwealth potentially a much broader organization.
And was that a first? That one of the member countries would take leadership?
Because the British influence, as the French influence in La Francophonie, was exercised more quietly. They were, even if someone else was the chair, the mother country was at the head of the table. And that changed in the Commonwealth in that case. And that's the kind of change that happens now. I mean, we are in an era where countries that we once regarded as being incapable of doing much, getting their act together, are competing strongly with us on economic grounds and on other grounds. So conditions change, leadership has to change. Attributes remain. And we have attributes, assets, that are not unique to us, but their combination is virtually unique. And they give us much more weight internationally than our economic strength does, or indeed than our military strength does. I don't want to demean the others. They're obviously important. But this capacity to draw people together respectfully is a real Canadian asset.
And human rights, obviously, is an area where our leadership is recognized.
A central part of that. We're far from perfect in that, as the Indigenous issue in Canada demonstrates, but yes.
So that's the next story is about human rights. It's Danilo, I don't know if I say it right, Danilo Shumuk. Yeah. He's a Ukrainian dissident. He was a prisoner for 42 years, and you help him get liberated, basically. And on screen, we see him. He's sitting in the chair of the Speaker of the House. So what's the story behind this picture?
Danilo, it's not just that he was in prison all those years. His offense was that he was a Ukrainian nationalist. And in the Soviet Union of that time, the people cracked down, the regime cracked down on Soviet nationalists. He was lucky, in a sense, because when he spent all that time in Siberia, he at least wasn't killed. He had family in Vernon, British Columbia, and they appealed to several Canadian governments to try to have Mr. Shumuk released from prison on the understanding that his family would look after him in Vernon. John Turner was very active in that, particularly, I guess, as minister. And it happened that Canada had not had an official visit to the Soviet Union for, I think, 12 years until I visited. And I met en route the president of Ukraine. And I raised the Chimook question. But there's a little protocol to foreign visits. The Canadian press comes with you. And they're there for the photographs and other less essential discussions. And then normally, and it still happens, the head of government, the host, says, well, ladies and gentlemen of the press, thank you for coming, and we're now going to go to our private meetings. And so the media was with us, including a particularly vigorous anti-communist, and I have to say, in many ways, anti-Clark journalist for the Toronto Sun. And we were in this meeting with Ukraine, and I said, well, perhaps our journalists would like to step aside. And the president of Ukraine said, I'm not afraid of the press. Let them stay. So I said, okay, we'll stay. And I raised the Chimook case, and he sort of refused, and we had this debate back and forth. But the Toronto Sun ran this great headline saying, Clark stands up to Ukraine. And I think in other ways that sort of changed the dynamic internally. This had become an issue that probably the Soviet Union, when they looked at it, they thought, is this worth it? Mm-hmm. So they freed Danilo Chimook. And it happened that he was coming to Vernon. Lord knows why he did this. He was coming to Vernon via Ottawa. So he came to Ottawa, and it was during Easter. And Maureen and I and Catherine were in Easter at the time, and we're in Ottawa at the time. And I met him, and I thought the thing to do would be to take him, this man who had been imprisoned for being a Ukrainian for these decades, into our House of Commons. And the House was not sitting. We sat him in that speaker's chair, and then we walked out, and I showed him where all the important people in the House of Commons sat. I said, I sit there, and I said, the leader of the opposition's there, and I said, and here's where the Prime Minister sits. And he said, through his interpreter, he said, I know where the Prime Minister sits. He sits beside Mr. Mazunkowski. And I said, how did you know that? And he said, when I was in prison in Siberia, my relatives in Vernon would send me stories about what could happen to you in a country like Canada if your name was Natishin or Mazunkowski or Poprosky. And I thought, what a wonderful Canadian story that is. I took him that same day across to the Supreme Court, which was not in session, but Chief Justice Dixon was there. And the Chief Justice happened into the lobby as we were there. And I told him the story, introduced him to Chimook, and he said, I want to talk to you. We went up to the Chief Justice's office. Just extraordinary change in a demonstration of the differences we talk about when we compare societies.
We touched upon that a bit now, but how did you experience that whole area of the crumbling of the Eastern Bloc, the end of the Cold War? Because you were at External Affairs when that was happening. I
was, and you talk about the crumbling and really what happened afterward. I think the falling of that wall was much more than a political act. I think that it opened up senses of possibility everywhere in the world. Curiously, it's funny, it coincided with the widespread use of the internet. And so in effect, you had two revolutions happening simultaneously. One was the fall of this very physical wall, but the other was the fall of a wall that nobody knew was there. And it meant that there was a capacity for communication that had not been there before. So it really was a symbol of freedom. But as is often the case with symbols, they have a different impact upon the people who are directly involved than they do sometimes on the wider world. And shortly after the wall fell, Canada hosted, I guess, the first ever meeting of the countries of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Pact, and NATO. And it was on the question of what was then called open skies. In effect, it was to have an agreement among all of the countries that had been opposed to one another before about the capacity of countries of the other side, the former other side, to fly aircraft over their space to see if, in fact, the disarmament that had been undertaken was following. Remember the famous phrase by President Reagan, in terms of dealing with the Soviet Union, you have to trust but verify. And so this was the instrument of verification. In any event, I chaired that meeting. I was the host foreign minister. And one of the issues that just surprised me, I should have been prepared for it, but I wasn't, was the attitude of the foreign ministers of the former Eastern European powers, now separate nations, towards Edward Shevardnadze, who had been the Soviet foreign minister, and who was a man at that stage admired by everybody. But the Poles, the Hungarians, the others around the table, even though they respected and liked him, made his life unusually difficult at the table. And I found I had this unusual problem as chair, to have to look after the sensitivities of the former foreign minister of the Soviet Union. And that showed me how complex some of these issues were going to be later on. Canada played, as other countries did, but we played a very active role in trying, first of all, in helping shape that change through the OSCE, which had held some of the satellite countries to account on commitments they'd made, but also afterwards. There were a number of organizations that were engaged in providing a bridge between those countries and Canada. Maureen was involved actively in one of those because she was the chair of the Canadian Bar Association organization that brought young lawyers from some of those countries to Canada. And one of the problems they ran into, question of old regimes and new regimes, was that they were looking to draw the sort of brightest and most open-minded of the young lawyers in Warsaw Pact countries. And of course, the system was still in control of the choices. So it sent the nephews, or wanted to send the nephews or the nieces of people who were, and to the credit of the team that Maureen led, they were able to winnow through that and get some and what that did, and there were countless other organizations that did similar things, it created personal and professional bridges across the country, across the countries.
Of course, the United States were also our principal partner, of course, and you got in your different, as Prime Minister, leader of the opposition, Secretary of State, you got to know them all. Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, Schultz, Henry Kissinger. You had to deal with them all at some point. So how would you define that relationship and the way you handled it and the way Canada handled it through the regimes and the ethos of that time?
One of the essential elements is to establish some kind of personal relation with American leaders. One of the other fundamental elements is to recognize that even though we are very important to them, we are not at the top of their attention because we are not a troublesome country, particularly. And the countries that receive much more attention proportionately are the countries that cause the Americans trouble. So we have to build in capacities. We have to work on developing capacities that that keep us on their mind. Sometimes some of the personal relations are extraordinarily successful. I suppose the most notorious and effective was Mr. Mulroney's with President Reagan, which was almost without parallel and was very effective. But it worked in a number of other ways. I inherited a system as foreign minister that had been created by Alan McEachern and George Shultz before I became minister, and it was that there would be a quarterly meeting of the Canadian Foreign Minister and the Secretary of State of the U.S., and we would do it, whatever the other engagements were, twice in the U.S., twice in Canada, every year. And it meant that when the two ministers got together, obviously the foreign services and other organizations in both countries that had matters they wanted to resolve knew that this was a tipping point, this was a decision point, and it kept Canada on the minds of the U.S., on the minds of the U.S. governors in a very effective way. So that was an instrument that worked. We have to recognize that for a long time, Canadians and Americans were not as aware as we now are of other elements in the world. And so we have to work even harder to keep ourselves on the minds of the Americans. The other thing we have to recognize, the other side of that coin, as we were discussing earlier, is that our interest has to be in a world larger than the U.S. Obviously, the U.S. has to be the primary preoccupation for us in bilateral relations. But we've discussed before this capacity we have elsewhere and opportunity, and we have to work on that. Often, past American governments have welcomed that in some cases. They did often in Latin America, where whether the new government will is going to be a question that we'll all just have to wait and see.
We looked in your phone and we searched and searched. We didn't find a picture of you with Yasser Arafat. There's a reason for that, isn't there?
There's a reason for that. Yes, there is. That picture earlier of Mr. Mandela was taken 2 weeks after he had been let out of prison. It was taken in Zambia. And there was a group of about 80, maybe 90 members of the African National Congress, the people who had been his warriors and supporters in exile, who were meeting him for the first time after he'd been out of prison. And they had invited a number of other prominent people there. There had always been a close relation between the African National Congress and the Palestinian Liberation Organization for obvious reasons. And so Yasser Arafat was invited. And I was invited not in my Canadian capacity, but in my capacity as chair of the Commonwealth Committee of Foreign Ministers. It was a fascinating meeting. At the same time in Canada, the government of Canada, I as minister, was working to change Canadian policy with regard to the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people. Self-determination, autodétermination, is a tricky question in Canada, and we're always careful about it. We had been for a long time, so we hadn't accepted it. And we had decided that it was the time now to officially recognize that Palestinian right. That was controversial in Canada. And Yasser Arafat, I think, was sensitive to the controversy. And he probably knew that the last thing I needed in a foreign visit was a picture with Yasser Arafat on the front page of La Presse or the Globe and Mail. And so he, when a photographer sort of came near us, he would always move away. And I wondered if I hadn't bathed that morning or just what it was. But I think it was a deliberate understanding that this would have been difficult for me. There's another story about that meeting with Mandela, if I may, because it speaks of Mandela. He came into this meeting of his former supporters and gave a short speech. And there was then a question by one of his fiercest supporters that was highly critical of the Afrikaan, who had been his captors, who'd kept him in prison. And his answer was, to his supporters, he said, "We have to understand how difficult all this is for them. We, the blacks who have now achieved equality, have to recognize how difficult this is for the people who had imprisoned us." And I thought, what an act, what a spirit of generosity, which later, of course, came to define Mandela's approach to things. But it was one of the most moving single moments I experienced in Canadian public life, because most of us, maybe all of us, certainly most of us, would have been freighted with a sense of grievance when we came to that forum. But he knew that he had to send a signal of reconciliation and of respect, and he did that.
I would like to have you comment a little card you got. So when you were Prime Minister, Canada launched some of its very first initiatives on the environment. And so there was a joint meeting with the United States. And this is a card from George Shultz, Secretary of State. And it says, for Joe Clark, this acid rain stuff sure makes your armpits itch. So was that a Christmas card, or?
He went on to say, why don't you do something about it? And later on, we did. But it's, you know what it is. And George Shultz was a very understanding man, but I wouldn't be surprised if one of his smart staff members wrote it for him, and some of my smart staff members wrote similar things for me, staff and foreign affairs ministers, because those personal touches keep a relationship going. And after I scratched, I decided that this was an act of friendship. Yeah.
Indeed. You're a regular user of your own archives, and you're the exception rather than the rule, as former prime ministers go. So how would you describe your relationship with your own archives and with this institution?
I've learned an awful lot about what I did by looking at them. And I must say that I appreciate not only the professionalism of the archivists, but their ability to find things in the archives that I can't. But they are an immense, very often now, and that was a long time ago, my period as Prime Minister, even my period as Foreign Minister, very often things come up where I have to think about what exactly happened. And I'm asked to make comparisons that I don't want to make when my recollection of my experience might be a little enfeebled by age and the passage of time. So I can check on that. And I found the people, the officials working with you in the archives to be extremely helpful and professional. When I look at all those boxes there, I wonder where they find the patience to. Oh, those are the unprocessed boxes. So yeah. This is patience to come. You're going to have to show.
Maybe one last question. In this very room, I don't know if you have the time to go through it, but you should before you leave. There's an extraordinary exhibition called Open Books, and it is about an homage to the Chinese tradition of folding books. And that we have to thank for this exhibition somebody called Maureen McTeer, that you may have heard of. And although it sounds very...
Not only have I heard of her, she tried to make me change my name.
Well, actually, that's where I was going with this, because although it may sound strange in 2016, her decision to keep her maiden name didn't go unnoticed in the 70s. And so there's an anecdote about that decision, isn't there?
There is. But also, I noticed on the way in that you have some of the letters that were written to Maureen on display, and I'm glad you have them, because I think we lost some of them. But it was quite surprising to me, the number of people, women principally, who had written after the controversy arose about Maureen keeping her name, saying how much her example had encouraged them. It was a different time from now, and it was seen as I won't go into all the arguments, but a constant theme was, I had been troubled by this limitation upon who I was, but I was not going to do anything about it. And now I'm encouraged to do something about it. So the story, though, to which you're referring, because it became a controversy in the country, and in fact, the Globe and Mail, I think, put a reporter on for 3 weeks to try to see if there had ever been an instance when Maureen had used her own name had used my name after the marriage. They couldn't find one. So, but it was an indication of the time that people thought this was either an act or something not genuine. And the party was not entirely happy with it. There was an annual meeting of the Progressive Conservative Party of Manitoba in Winnipeg, and this was a question that was roiling around, never raised on the floor, but it was always present. And the president of the Manitoba PC Women's Association, a young woman of about 80, with a very British accent, British forebears, came to the microphone and said, "Does anyone here know who Elizabeth Windsor is?" And there was sort of bafflement in the audience. And she said, "Elizabeth Windsor is our queen. If she can keep her own name, so can Maureen McTeer," which I thought was a great line.